So the event itself today is a collaboration between the Seamus Heaney Centre and the Development and Alumni Relations Office at Queen's, and I'm delighted to welcome both Susannah and Glenn. Now, before we get started, there are just a couple of housekeeping points that I would like to go over. One of those, as I've already said, is that everyone's microphone and camera should be on mute, so ensure that that remains the case. The event will consist of a conversational section between Susannah and Glenn, followed by a Q&A session, during which you'll have an opportunity to pose your questions. Can you please type those questions into the chat function, and that will be on screen, and those questions will then be asked by the host. Before we kick off, I do also need to let everybody know that the event is being recorded. So I'd now like to introduce Susannah and Glenn. Susannah graduated from Queen's in 2017 with a BA in creative writing and is currently completing a PhD at the Seamus Heaney Centre. She released her debut novel, Tennis Lessons, in July 2020, published by Doubleday UK. And she's currently working on a second novel. She is also the author of 2 poetry pamphlets, the most recent of which, Bloodthirsty for Marriage, came out in March, and for which she was the recipient of an Eric Gregory Award. Glenn Patterson has been the director of the Seamus Heaney Centre since 2017. He's written 3 works of non-fiction and 10 novels, most recently Where Are We Now, which was published in 2020. He also co-wrote the film Good Vibrations, for which he was nominated for Outstanding Debut at the 2014 BAFTA Film Awards. Susannah and Glenn, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I'm just getting your videos.
Hey, Susannah.
There you go.
Hello.
How are you both? It's lovely to see you. Thank you. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to come out of this event now and leave it to you two folks to take over. But if I can say to all attendees, feel free to start submitting your questions now. And when the Q&A session comes in, we'll be asking those. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks, Glenn. Susannah, over to you.
Andy, thanks a million. Thanks very much indeed. And hello, everyone who we can't yet see or hear. Look forward to getting some questions from you as we go on. Susannah and I are going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. And before that, we thought that we should start this, probably should start this with a reading from Tennis Lessons. So would you be okay doing that, Susannah?
Yep. Just gonna dive in. 17 years old, May 16th, today. You wake to a hot and itchy wetness between your thighs. You wriggle on the sheets, feeling the fabric of your pajama bottoms get pulled taut around your legs and made warm by what has happened. You remember who you are in increments, and you wish you could sleep for a month, a year, 5 years. It's the day of your A-level history exam. Your bed sits low to the ground, and so you roll off the mattress and onto your hands and knees on the floor. You stay like that for a moment, curled in child's pose. You breathe in, and you wonder if it's your body you can smell, or the world. The bathroom is dark and cool like a church vestibule. The blue toilet seat feels matte against your ass, and the floor is tiled with yellow and beige linoleum. The borders between the colours indistinct and puffy, like a sepia-toned landscape or the mustard-coloured insulation that lines the attic. When you were little, you liked to pretend the toilet was a small airship, its engine powered by whatever plopped or slid along the sides of the bowl. When you look into the gusset of your pants, you are confronted with a small, glistening blood clot. It stares at you, and you stare back, shocked by the subdued horror of it. You giggle, and it seems to mirror you, its embers wiggling. You put your finger below the gusset. It feels humid, and press upwards. The nucleus of the clot splits slightly, and when you let go, it reforms and rocks back and forth, keeping time with your breathing. You know the normal thing to do would be to flush it, to peel the clot off the fabric with toilet paper and flush it away like they do with dead goldfish on American sitcoms. You've never had a goldfish, have never wanted the responsibility. You tense for a moment and listen to the splashes of the airship. You hold your breath and keep still and try to detect the clot's absence inside you. If there's a new, cool chasm somewhere in your bloodstream to prove that you're missing a piece. You wish you could take the clot and use it to plug that other perforation deep inside you, the one that whistles with cold air that you are never not aware of these days. You shake away the bad thoughts. Not today. The circumference of the clot is about that of a blueberry. Not the largest menstrual clot you've shed, but not insignificant either. You marvel at your body's ability to create and then reject it so willingly, to turn something so delicate and glossy into waste matter. Where do all the discarded scraps of people end up? You take a piece of toilet roll and scoop the clot onto the paper. You whisper, "Hello, goldfish," and stand. You ball the paper violently and throw it into the bowl. You read somewhere once that the body replaces all its red blood cells every 120 days. If that's the case, all the dark red inside you is still dirty and unclean. You flush the toilet and walk to your bedroom. The sunset-colored chimera of your big toe palpitates merrily with each step. Glenn, you're on mute.
The only interesting thing I had, I said it and I was on mute. I was going to say thank you for the reading, and the big toe, for anybody who hasn't read Tennis Lessons yet, the big toe runs and runs, if that's the right phrase to use for that. Could I also say maybe that the book probably should come with one of those opening credit disclaimers that no tennis balls are actually harmed in the making of this novel. It's a great title. Can I ask you, was that a title that came early in the book, or was it one that came at the end?
No, the title was actually one of the last things to come. For a long time, the book was called Clot, and then I was informed that that was gross. And then the book was called for a while Some Things You'll Remember, and then I gave it some thought and realized that that just sounds like a kind of historical period romance about a woman with typhoid. So I thought, I'm not going to use that either. And then I kind of had finished it and was working through the last few permutations. And I'm so reticent to say this because I feel people won't buy it. It's not about tennis, but the kind of notion of tennis lessons for me became this sort of kind of metaphorical thing within the narrative. There's this scene where the protagonist is excited about the prospect of taking tennis lessons and what this represents about her life to come, and what this will be a symbol of in her maturing and in her growth as a person, and what this will bring for her in terms of experience and wisdom. And then most of the novel is about all those expectations and hopes just never coming to fruition.
Well, it's particularly lovely where that scene does come, and again, I'm aware that there might be some people who haven't actually read it, so exactly where that comes is beautiful. It's a really lovely moment in the novel. And I mean, I think it's really interesting with books. Sometimes they are, from the moment you start it, you have an idea of what it's called, and that drives it. And then there are other times where you get to the end, and it's only by reading what you have done that you realize what you're going to call it. Sometimes your editor just tells you you're not calling it the thing that that you wanted to call it, which has happened to me a couple of times. Andy,
well, I wanted to call this book The Corrections, but apparently
somebody did that. Andy was very good at mentioning that you studied for your undergraduate degree at Queen's University, where you studied creative writing. And you're also at Queen's now doing a PhD in creative writing, poetry. There was a wee bit in between where you went away for a while, and you went to a place, Goldsmiths. Is that what they call that?
It's in a place, London.
Okay. So you went there for a little while, but did you start the tennis lessons? Did that start while you were, or did you start it while you were studying for the MA in creative writing at Goldsmiths?
No, I actually started it midway through my final year of my Queen's undergrad.
Right, okay.
When I was very blessed to not really have any hobbies or interests, so I didn't have much else to do other than start writing a novel.
So did some of the novel then form part of the creative writing work that was assessed when you were an undergraduate?
Actually, there was a short story I wrote in my second year at Queen's for my short fiction module, and that short story went on to become the novel. But none of the novel got submitted for my final year stuff because I was really using it as a means of not having to do my work for my final year.
There's I'm just passing over that bit where you say we're avoiding doing your work for your final year. Again, for anybody who may not have read the novel yet, and maybe hadn't heard you read from it, very quickly I'm sure they'll have picked up on one of the most striking features of it as a piece of writing, which is the use of that second person narrator. And it's interesting you said that it had started as a short story, because it's something that I've mostly come across in short stories, and I just wondered about that as a decision. I'm never sure if they are decisions or it's whether you get a feel as you write. We think this just feels right, I'm going to keep on with it, but it is it is one of the features of it.
And it's interesting because something I realized quite soon into writing it in the second person is that everyone hates the second person. So I'm not sure why it was a choice I made, because people really vehemently dislike it. But I tried out the first person and I tried out the third person. And the first person kind of felt too assertive for the kind of character I wanted to write. And the third person, there was almost this like privilege of distance between between me and she, and between an ostensible reader and she. And then I tried the second person, which is a voice that I found to be used really well in books like Rape, a Love Story by Joyce Carol Oates, and in lots of short stories by Laurie Moore. And what's really interesting about when it's used is it's invariably used to explore some kind of power dynamic, and the protagonist to whom the you is addressed is so often in a position of passivity or powerlessness, and there's this accusatory tone about the you form that kind of holds that protagonist in place and makes them experience these things, but it also can kind of then implicate the reader and take them and hold them at this kind of discomforting proximity where they then are also implicated, or they have to actively be working hard to not implicate themselves in what was happening. And because the book looks at things, this protagonist who is so kind of passive within her own life and lives this really kind of vibrant inner idiosyncratic life, but externally she's not really doing much, she's not really saying anything, she's kind of stagnating and floundering, and then lots of life just happens to her. So it felt to me like really the only kind of voice to write it in.
Yeah. And one of the things, for some reason, Solar Bones, Mike McCormick's novel, came into my head as something that, you know, the thing about Solar Bones, there are no full stops, or it's one long sentence, and you know, that goes ahead of it, and then when you start to read it, you think that you forget that this is a novel that doesn't have a full stop. And likewise, as a second person narrative, it so quickly you establish that and do it so successfully that it is that that thing that as the reader you have almost forgotten to notice what it is, that it is quite an unusual narrative point of view for a novel, and it's also, but they're great. You get great fun out of it as well. One of my favorite lines in the book is when your friend Rachel, her friend from childhood, says, "Don't get all you-y." Don't get all overthinking. And I thought I loved that, because of course, you know, you is how we know this character, and it's just it's a lovely moment where it just kind of flips it around.
Yeah, she couldn't be any more Yui.
Yes.
She's Huey Lewis and the U's.
I said that's my favorite line, but it's a toss up between that and one where his name is Robbie. He's doing a PhD in human rights. You met him in the Students' Union bar, and he's not how you hoped he would be, which is a fabulous line. But so you'd started the novel when you were finishing up at Queen's, and then you went to Goldsmiths and continued writing it there. And were you workshopping that, or was that something again you were doing to try and distract yourself from the work?
I workshopped it a little bit in my second term. I spent a lot of the first term ignoring it because I had been in such a rush to finish the first draft, and this was the thing about having started off writing poetry and then trying to write fiction. I imagine if you're a really excellent poet, you make quite a seamless transition into writing fiction. But I started writing fiction being a not very good poet, and all the ways in which I was a bad poet, I then became a bad fiction writer. And the first draft was just this homogenous lump of inchoate thoughts and just nonsense, and it was so bad. So I abandoned it for a really long time. And then in my second term at Goldsmiths, I came back to it and workshopped it a little, but it was around that time that I also decided to make my grand return to trying to write short stories. Right. And it seems kind of slightly counterintuitive, but it was trying to write short stories that's the reason that was kind of instrumental in the novel happening at all. Because I don't normally write short stories because they're far too difficult. But then halfway through my MA, I took a notion and decided to try and write one. And so I started reading loads and loads of short stories to try and figure out how they work and what makes for a good one. And I was reading like Track by Nicole Flattery, and The Embassy at Cambodia by Zadie Smith, and Hills Like White Elephants by Hemingway, and The Lady with the Dog by Chekhov, and You Are the Second Person by Kisei Lemon. I was reading all these short stories, and it was really calculated and cynical because I hadn't read a lot of short stories prior to then, and I was doing it now specifically as an exercise in trying to learn their machinations. But it was good because it probably made me appreciate the form and how tricky it was. But I was lucky because the short story that I wound up writing is how I ended up meeting Sophie Scard, who is now my editor.
Oh, right, okay.
And she read the short story through, because it was through the White Review that she wound up reading it. And she said, well, do you have anything else? And, you know, serendipitously, I had written a novel for no reason. So I sent it to her. And again, like it's so much of it was to do with just good fortune, because Sophie was at quite an early stage in her career at that time, and so was just beginning to build her own list, and was probably very patient and generous with her time to a much greater degree than maybe an older agent would have been, because I really cannot stress how terrible the novel was when I sent it to her. But she, she helped me like fix it and make it slightly less terrible. So yeah, so that's how all that happened.
And you, just to go back to what you were saying earlier in that answer, you did start, poetry came first, and so the novel was, well, something you started to do after you started to write poetry. I think I'm thinking increasingly it's not unusual for writers to be working in more than one form, but still poetry and fiction, or particularly poetry and the novel, it's not all that common a combination. And so I'm interested in that it was short story, poetry, then novel, left the novel aside, wrote a short story, and then looked back at the novel again. And then you came back to Queen's and enrolled in a PhD in creative writing, and it's poetry again. That was a statement. That didn't sound like a question, did it? Did you? But that's so. And then of course you were publishing poetry. You published a couple of 2 pamphlets before the novel came out.
Yeah, with the Lifeboat, who are run by 2 individuals, very active and probably largely responsible for a lot of the work that is coming out of, from emerging writers in Belfast right now, Manuela Moser and Stephen Connolly. And I guess, the thing is that the kind of poetry I've always written is poetry with quite a strong sort of narrative thrust, in that it will have characters, it'll have dialogue, it'll have, some semblance of plotting, but not so much plotting as to make it not poetry, which is probably, again, to reiterate, Tennis Lessons probably has such a notable absence of plotting as to make it not a novel. But yeah, I probably wouldn't have ever pursued writing to the extent that I did if, groups like the Lifeboat and the Tangerine hadn't been about to make irritating people like me feel talented.
If I could just say that for anybody who maybe is watching this and doesn't know the Lifeboat or Tangerine, as Susannah says, the Lifeboat is started out as a series of readings and pamphlet publications, and is a press now, and is run by Stephen Connolly and Manuela Moser, both of whom were doing PhDs in creative writing in poetry at Queen's, and the Lifeboat, which is edited by PhD students at the Seamus Heaney Centre as well. And it's incredible. I mean, I'm director of the Seamus Heaney Centre. I'm bound to say this, but it is extraordinary the amount of writing that is coming out at the moment. And what is even more extraordinary about it, I think, is that so much of it is being generated by and published by the students themselves. It's quite, I mean, to my mind, I can't think of anything else quite like it in any of the other creative writing courses that I've been at or come across. It is quite an amazing congregation of people. And is that community helpful for you? Are there times you just think, I wish I could get away from other writers, or is it good that there is that center to people to go to?
I think it's brilliant. It's kind of like, those the little snake that's eating its own
yes
thumb. That's kind of what the writing and publishing community in Belfast is like. But it's great because it's just such second ground for writing, and it's not even just writing. It's the kind of conversations being generated and the directing of one another towards other writers who we might otherwise not be reading. And it's just a really nice kind of incubator for baby writers to get to get their delicious nutrients.
Something you said that that tennis lessons probably had so little plot as to hardly qualify as a novel. It has such an amount of plot. It's very character driven, and I mean, one of the things that it is beautiful on is friendship, and again, what it does is it tracks a number of characters over a period of years. The narrator's closest friend, Rachel. I think there are 11 when they meet, and I love the spaceship. The toilet recurs, but there's an incident about swallowing chewing gum, and it takes 7 years to work its way out. And what kind of people will we be in 7 years? They ask each other. We'll be grown up. We'll be doing things like making pasta. And of course, and the lovely thing about the novel is that we see them when they are 7 years on, and that little conversation is called back up again. But even characters who are less pleasant in their early years come back again and turn out to have facets that perhaps the reader didn't expect. It's so I mean it's a wonderful novel from the point of view of watching the development of not just one character but a group of characters over a period of years.
Yeah, because I guess when with writing you're sort of balancing what you know with what you don't know but could conceivably know or could conceivably make from what you do know. I love writing because I feel this compulsion to do it because it takes me away from myself while also making me feel like things I've done or thought or experienced up till now could be made mutable and made into a piece of fiction and therefore legitimized. And I was really interested in just the propensity of adolescents to go certain ways. There's probably this kind of ubiquity of uncertainty and fear, but then how that manifests in different ways in terms of whether people become cruel or become deeply introverted or become kind, and then seeing how that then can manifest differently in adulthood. And just that trajectory of life and expectation and disappointment were all things that I really wanted to explore. So I did.
I'm trying to keep an eye on time and allow other people to ask questions. So I'm not going to ask. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to tell you the question I'm not going to ask and sort of ask it anyway, which is the other decision that you make in the book, which is about place names. It's non-specific. We can infer certain things. I don't know what university you're referring to, which has a 4 out of 10 student satisfaction rating. Clearly, it's not one of the ones that we know. But what I did want to ask, maybe just in conclusion, and bring it back around to where you started with your reading and with your initial title. And I noticed in the Irish Times maybe about 2 weeks ago, Roisin Ingalls' column, and she was writing about the decision by RTE to remove a Tampax ad from TV because they'd received complaints, and in the course of her brilliant article, she referenced tennis lessons, and I was thinking, apart from the cheer that I put up myself, I just wondered for you what that was like, because a novel comes out and we kind of peek a little bit at the books pages to see if it's been noticed, and we kind of dread that it might have been noticed. But I just wondered what that was like, if first of all, if you had seen that, and how that felt for something you'd written to have become part of kind of a national conversation?
It's strange, because I guess, you know, thanks to the sort of cause and effect of one, interviews, and two, Arts Council funding applications, there's this implicit assumption that writers know what they're doing, and maybe some do, but I don't. And I could try and articulate that in some kind of quasi-flattering way and suggest that the wiser or better I get, the more I learn to question my own aesthetic principles. But it's not that, because I'm not getting wiser or better, just increasingly uncertain. And I'd say that it's probably dangerous to plan or even try to anticipate how bits of something you've written might outgrow or reach beyond the parameters of the thing itself. I mean, it's lovely if it's not a bit frightening, because I guess once something's published, it's as much, if not more so, the jurisdiction of a reader as it is of the writer. You just sort of sit and wait for someone to tell you what your book is about, and it would be hypocritical and churlish of me to disagree with them, because I've said I don't know what it's about. All of this is to say, it's lovely to be situated as a contributor to a conversation that someone thinks is important, but it's not something I ever anticipated happening.
Susannah, it's been brilliant. I've so enjoyed this bit of the conversation. I'm conscious that there are people who might have questions that they'd like to ask. Can I just say, I love the novel, and I know you said that you've got a draft of the second one already written?
Yes.
So what were you not doing what were you supposed to be doing when you were writing the first draft of the second novel?
I mean, the PhD's going great.
But for anybody who is watching this and hasn't read it yet, it is such a brilliant novel, and when you get to the tennis lessons passage, well, it's a remarkable passage in a great novel. I'd like Andy, if you'd maybe come back in, because I know you're just keeping an eye on questions, and maybe if you'd like to come in and tell us if there are any questions. Donna?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, the pair of you, for that, folks. That was superb. Susannah, before we go start with the questions that people have been submitting during the course of the event itself, we did have a couple of questions emailed into us. Now, the first of these is one that Glenn brought up earlier, but it relates to the second person perspective that you used, and what inspired you to do that. And I know you pretty much answered that question, but perhaps were there any particular challenges that you found with writing in the second person, or was it something that just sort of came naturally, as it were?
There are definite challenges, not so much in writing it, but in how it reads subsequently. It can become really kind of dangerously repetitive, to just have that and so often it's so easy to fall into this trap of syntactic structure, where every sentence almost takes on this kind of formulaic quality, and it's having to think really hard about this pronoun that you've chosen, and how to try and work it in a way that it doesn't start to stagnate, because after a point it can just seem like this interminable reiteration of instructions. So it's just trying to balance it with thoughts that maybe don't necessarily require that proliferation of views, and with observations and with dialogue, to keep the character at the forefront of the mind, but also enough variety that it's a pleasurable reading experience. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say whether it is a pleasurable reading experience, but
the other question that was submitted in advance was as follows. For me, the prose had a very poetic quality to it. Given that you have written a lot of poetry, what do you see yourself as first, if either of them? Do you see yourself as a poet or a novelist?
I see myself as a blight on the cultural landscape. I, I guess, I don't know. I guess it varies. It varies depending on what I'm doing in any given moment and what I'm finding easier at any given moment. There are some days when writing poetry just seems deeply intuitive to me, and days when writing fiction is like just having to file your fingernails. I hate filing my fingernails. It just feels like this really kind of arduous, low-key, monotonous hum of upkeep. That's what fiction can feel like sometimes. So on those days, I feel like a poet, but on other days, if I'll write like a really what I think is a good passage of dialogue, or the really lovely moments are when I'm writing a sentence or a description, and I realize that I'm bringing to bear in my fiction what I use in poetry, which is trying to view the quotidian in slightly unusual or idiosyncratic ways, and to imbue strange into the normal. And then there's like a really like nice synthesis between the two, and I'll feel great about myself, and I'll buy myself a hat.
Could I just add to that our first director at the Seamus Heaney Centre, Kieran Carson, was a poet and also wrote fiction and books that defied categorization. And I remember having to introduce Kieran at something, and there was a chant about a Manchester United footballer called Paul Scholes, which just went, "He scores goals, Paul Scholes, he scores goals." And so I told Kieran that I was just going to say, "He makes books, Kieran Carson, he makes books." And sometimes the books he made were called poetry, and sometimes they were called novels, but it was all part of the same endeavor and exploration.
Yes, I concur.
The first question that we actually had submitted has a reference / comparison here that you may not have anticipated when you started writing tennis lessons, but here goes. So the book ends with a smile after a particularly painful moment. Having gone back into the pain after it seemed to have been overcome to some extent, it reminded me of the ending to Once Upon a Time in America, where Robert De Niro's character manages to rise above the horror of his dilemma. It's a sort of Zen moment. Buddhist influenced for me. Was the smile at the end of your book doing something of the same sort? Was it a sort of holy acceptance of the pain?
Oh, that's a lofty thought. I like that. Because I guess so much about the novel is about different ways, different types of reconciliation, and one of the biggest reconciliations within it is the protagonist with herself, trying to reconcile who she wants to be, what she wants for her life, and with what is actually available to her, and who she is as a person. And in this final moment is almost a manifestation of that, as she's had all this hope and expectation for this one thing, and it's gone disastrously because she has once again behaved in an entirely non-intuitive way, and it's gone tits up. But yet, even amongst all the chaos around her and this disappointment, she has this moment of just experiencing the world around her, and there's a beauty to that in taking a moment to step outside of herself when she's someone who lives so fixedly and unreservedly within her own head. So I guess, yeah, there is a kind of zen-ness to it, or a kind of catharsis, into just looking at the world around her and finding peace within it.
Yes. Okay.
Maybe.
The next question here is, the prologue totally hooked me. How many edits of the opener did you go through before you arrived at the finished piece?
Ooh, what's funny, when I first started writing it, I was reading a lot of books that do slightly experimental things with, if there's such a thing as experimental, with their structure. Like Gwendolyn Riley's First Love, and N.W. by Zadie Smith, and a lot of Virginia Woolf, and lots of books that have a slightly, maybe, well, Virginia Woolf, it's not a slightly modernist influence, given that she was a modernist, but more modern books that have these modernist structural elements. And in the first few drafts of the book, it was completely not chronological. It was all over the place. I had this one day that now forms the centerpiece of the book. I had that stretching over the entire arc, and then these indented passages that were either flashbacks or flash forwards. And a couple of very clever people suggested to me, have you tried putting this in the order in which it happens? I was furious, because, you know, how dare they question my methods? And then I did it, and I was really embarrassed to realize that it was actually a much better book and much more enjoyable, and that actually for the first year of writing it, I had been actively impeding it as a book that anybody might ever want to read. So then once I had it in this chronological order, that was then when I thought about what slight elements of linear manipulation I might like to do in order to aid in the kind of propulsion of the narrative. And that's when the prologue and the epilogue happened, and that slight linear frippery that happens in the middle. So that was all quite late in the writing of it.
We have a question here. What was the original inspiration behind tennis lessons?
Well, the short story that it came from was about a girl who crashes a car on the day of her A-level history exam. And you realize that the kind of anxiety and turmoil that she's feeling that leads her to this is driven by the fact that she has been sexually assaulted several weeks prior. And that was what the novel then grew out of. But I was just really interested in writing a novel that wasn't about trauma, but that shows a character's experience of trauma and their attempts to not address it, and their attempts to reject it, and how that then influences their life thereafter. Also, I was really interested in writing a character who, prior to this, was a deeply idiosyncratic thinker and who struggles to gain any kind of authoritative foothold in her own life, and who struggles with introversion and a real inability to communicate her own desires and fears, and how that then, coupled with a sexual assault, just kind of spirals out of control, and the long-term detrimental effects of that, and how she ultimately needs to acknowledge that and reconcile herself to that and recover from it.
Thank you. There's a couple of sort of more general questions, I suppose, that aren't specifically related to the book.
I was in the army with general questions. Sorry.
Who would you, as a writer, who are your main influences?
Ooh, okay. Main influences: Zadie Smith, who I think I've mentioned at least 18 times already. She's exceptional. while I was editing the book, I read Monkey Grip by Helen Garner, an Australian writer. I read that book over and over again, and she's really excellent in how she writes in a very realist mode, but with these beautiful poetic flourishes of language and description. Lisa Halliday is another writer I love, and poets like John Ashbery and Claudia Rankine would really influence me in how I broach, because Claudia Rankine's book Citizen is written primarily in the second person, and that was a book I read a lot at the time of writing tennis lessons. It's verse really rather than fiction, but it's such an interesting use of the you and the mutable functions of the you for addressing a kind of collective consciousness. And John Ashbery just writes weird stuff, which I'm a big fan of.
Mm-hmm. And during your writing process, when you were first working on something new, do you find it helpful or a hindrance to be writing, to be reading other writers' stuff? As a comparison, some musicians, for example, would say when they're recording a new album, they try not to listen to sort of, works by their sort of, people that have influenced them, because it kind of seeps into their own work in a way that perhaps they don't want it to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I would say it's the opposite for me. I would say that I'm writing considerably better when I'm also reading widely, and not just necessarily reading writers whose work might be thematically or formally similar to my own, reading a broad range of stuff and hoping that actually ideas or styles might permeate kind of what I'm writing, and you have to trust your own authority and individuality of voice that you will then take those influences and stay true to yourself while also just becoming better, because the thing you have to, I think, is keep in your mind is that everyone you're reading is better than you. So why wouldn't you want to learn from them?
There's another sort of couple of questions, and then I think we're sort of coming into the last few minutes of it. How are you finding writing the second novel? Is it easier? Are you finding it more difficult?
It's just different. With the first novel, I just started writing, and the main goal was to just write away from the beginning rather than actually write towards anything. And that's why it was so bad. It was just like a bowling alley with no end. Whereas this time I decided beforehand what I actually wanted the novel to be about, and it's probably suffering in ways that the first novel didn't for that, because in the first one maybe I was so unreservedly unconcerned with plot that I was able to explore these thoughts and these tangents to their most logical or illogical conclusion. Whereas this time I'm approaching it much more structurally. So there's probably passages that are far too sparse as a consequence, and that I haven't made beautiful in ways that they could be, and they just, I'll have to go back and do that now.
Can I just, B.S. Johnson, the English novelist, said something to the effect that every time he satisfied himself that he knew something about how to write a novel, it was of absolutely no use when he came to do the next one, which is part of, and they all are completely different in what they ask of you. And have you got a title for the? Why am I so obsessed with titles? Have you got a title for the second one, and did it come early?
I have a working title. When it actually comes out, it may be a completely different. In fact, you can tell me now if this is a bad title.
Well, just me or everybody?
Yeah, no, just you.
Ask
no,
Aaron.
we can open it up to the grip and do a poll.
Thumbs up or thumbs down in the chat, everybody.
Okay, okay, ready?
The working title is Common Decency.
Oh, I think that's a great title.
Okay.
No, there you go. John Gribben says yes.
Yeah, thank you, John.
I like that.
Well, look, as I say, we are coming towards the end now. I'd just again like to extend my thanks and to perhaps finish on Susannah. I suspect that some of the people watching this event live, and certainly some of the people who will be viewing the recordings when it's available, may be aspiring writers themselves. Are there 2 or 3 kind of takeaways or tips that you've picked up that you may not have been aware of when you started your journey?
I mean, it's funny because I think we probably assess the merits of any advice or tips on the basis of how successful the person is giving them. Whereas I would not say that anything about my lifestyle or methodological approach is advisable in the slightest. What would I say is some good advice? Don't write while you're also cooking pasta, because you'll either burn the pasta or the writing will be terrible. I'm sure I have another one. Use the OED. It's great. Look up the etymology of different words. Shoehorn them in. Pick something completely arbitrary and become completely obsessed with it and write about that.
Brilliant. Well, look, Susannah and Glenn, thank you very, very much for taking the time out this evening to participate in the event. It's yeah, fantastic, and it was something I've been looking forward to for a long time. And to everybody attending and who fielded their questions today, thank you very much for taking the time and effort. The event has been recorded, so it will be available to view as a recording over the coming days to week. Okay. Many thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Susannah. Thanks so much. And goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Cheerio. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.